The pie was already on the windowsill when Hazel Dorn arrived, and nobody thought to tell her. It wasn't meant for her. She had walked the last 4 miles from the junction at Coppervale because the wagon driver had turned east at the crossroads, without warning her that east was not where she needed to go. She hadn't said anything. She had climbed down, thanked him with the kind of politeness that cost nothing, and started walking. Her trunk was somewhere on that wagon. She had her satchel, the clothes on her back, and a letter folded 4 times in her coat pocket from a Mrs. Drummond. No, not that one, she reminded herself. Different woman entirely. From a Mrs. Audra Phelps of Ashfield Road, Larkmoor, Alberta, who had placed an advertisement in the Edmonton Bulletin seeking a housekeeper who could cook and was not afraid of early mornings. Hazel Dorn was 26 years old, the last of her family, and she had been afraid of very little since the autumn she turned 19 and learned what real loss felt like. The Phelps house was easy enough to find. The only house for 2 miles in any direction, with smoke coming from 2 chimneys at once. But when she pushed open the gate and came up the path, there was nobody home except a yellow dog who regarded her with profound indifference from beneath the porch steps. She knocked anyway. Twice. Then she sat down on the edge of the porch steps because her feet said it was time, and she looked out at the land. It was vast in the way she had not expected vastness to feel. She had grown up in Lethbridge, which was flat enough, but this was different. This was the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums, that made you suddenly aware of your own breathing. Grassland rolled toward a line of poplars in the west, already going gold. The sky was doing something complicated above the mountains that she could just see, or maybe only imagine, at the far horizon. The yellow dog crept up beside her eventually and laid its chin on her knee, and she scratched behind its ears without thinking about it. That was how Cormac Riley found her when he rode in 20 minutes later. Sitting on his front porch steps with her travel satchel beside her, scratching behind the ears of his dog, looking out at the land as though she had some arrangement with it. He pulled up. He was a big man, broader than the door frame she would later discover, with a face the color of old saddle leather and eyes that were neither gray nor brown, but somewhere in between the two. He did not say hello. He looked at her the way a man looks at an unexpected thing that has appeared on his property and is not yet certain whether it represents a problem. "Mrs. Phelps isn't here," he said. "I gathered," said Hazel. "I'm Hazel Dorn. I answered an advertisement." "I know." He swung down from the horse. She had to go to her sister's in Red Deer. Her sister had the baby early. "Mrs. Phelps left 2 days ago. She wasn't sure you'd come." Hazel absorbed this. "Is the position still open?" He looped the reins around the post and did not look at her when he answered. "The position is mine to fill now, I suppose. Audra is my cousin." He paused. "She won't be back before November. That's 2 months, near enough." Hazel looked at her satchel. She looked at the yellow dog. She thought about the 4 miles she had walked, and the trunk that was now somewhere east of where it needed to be, and the $7.30 that remained in the inside pocket of that satchel after the train from Lethbridge. "Mr. Rayleigh," she said, and she wasn't sure how she knew his name. Perhaps it had been in the letter, or perhaps she had simply put it together from the way he stood on this land, like it was his own bones. "I am a good cook, and I am not afraid of early mornings. I can have something on your table inside an hour if you'll show me where the kitchen is. After that you can decide." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had not allowed himself to do when he first rode in. She was small and tired, and her boots were muddy from the road, and there was a quality about her that he would not have been able to name then. He was not a man who named things easily, but that he recognized nonetheless. the quality of a person who has already survived the worst of it and has simply gotten on with the business of living. "Kitchen's through there," he said, and went to see to his horse. The first thing she found was that there was almost nothing in the larder. There were oats, a heel of salt pork, half a sack of flour going a little stale, and 4 eggs. There was a jar of something preserved that she opened carefully and determined was plum jam, and a tin of baking powder that rattled when she shook it. There was coffee. There were potatoes in a crate by the back door, some gone soft but most still good. She made potato soup and salt pork and biscuits because the biscuits were a matter of principle. Her mother had believed that a person's biscuits told you everything you needed to know about them, whether they had patience, whether they were careless, whether they understood the particular alchemy of fat and flour and not too much handling. Hazel's biscuits were her mother's biscuits now, passed through her hands the way certain things are passed. Without ceremony, without anyone deciding it was happening, until one day you realize you are the one who carries them. She had the table set and the food on it before dark. Cormac Rayleigh came in from the barn, washed at the pump outside, hung his hat on the peg by the door, and sat down without comment. He served himself soup. He ate. She had already eaten standing at the kitchen bench, the way she always did when she wasn't sure whether she was a guest or something else. He took a biscuit. He was halfway through it when he set it down and looked at it, and then looked toward the kitchen doorway. "Miss Dorn?" She appeared in the doorway. "Yes? Who made these?" It was such a plain question, such an unremarkable thing to ask, but there was something in the way he asked it, not absently, not as filler, that made her stand a little straighter without meaning to. "I did," she said. He looked at the biscuit again. He took another bite. "They're good," he said, and went back to his soup. 2 words. She stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, and then she went back to the kitchen and was surprised to find her eyes were stinging. She hadn't expected that. It was just a biscuit. It was just 2 words. But nobody had said so in a very long time. She stayed. There was no formal agreement, no handshake, no papers. He simply didn't suggest she leave, and she simply didn't go. And by the 3rd day, it had the feeling of something decided, though neither of them had decided it aloud. The rhythm of Larkmoor Station. That was what Cormac Rayleigh called his land. Though it wasn't much of a station anymore, just the name that had stuck from whoever built it before him was not difficult to learn. He was up before 5. He wanted coffee ready, and he wanted to be left alone with it, which suited her fine. Breakfast at 6, something hot and sustaining. Dinner at noon if the work was near the house, otherwise she left a covered plate. Supper when the lights started going. The work itself was not what she'd expected. She had thought housekeeper meant dusting and laundry and keeping things in order, and it did mean those things. But Mrs. Phelps had also kept the books, apparently, and Cormac Rayleigh had let them slide for 3 weeks in her absence, and there were invoices from the feed store in Larkmoor and from a man named Mr. Geddes in Calgary that appeared to have been used as bookmarks in various locations around the house. "Do you do figures?" he asked her on the 4th morning, setting a stack of papers beside her coffee cup without looking at her. She looked at the stack. "Well enough," she said. "Those need sorting out." He put his hat on and went out. She sorted them out. It took most of the day, but she sorted them out. He came in that evening and looked at the ledger she'd laid open on the desk, columns clear, figures checked against the receipts she'd found, folded inside an old almanac on the shelf. He stood there for a long moment looking at it. "Thank you, Miss Dorn," he said. That was all. Then he went and washed his hands for supper. She was beginning to understand that with Cormac Rayleigh, the ordinary words were the ones that mattered. He did not spend them carelessly. The trouble started in the second week, when the weather turned and the roof began to leak over the east bedroom. Her room, such as it was, and she spent a night with a pot on the floor, catching the drip, and said nothing about it in the morning, because she was not certain it was her place to say anything. He noticed the pot. When he passed the open door, he stopped. He looked at the pot. He looked at the ceiling. She was at the end of the hall with an armful of linen, and she braced herself for. She wasn't sure what. Irritation, perhaps. Or the implication that it was inconvenient. "That's been doing that since July," he said. "I should have seen to it." He paused. "I'll move you to the front room. The front room is I'll sleep in the bunkhouse. The hands are gone till spring. There's no one else in it." He said this the way he said most things, as though the matter were already settled, and the question was only whether she wanted to argue about something settled. "Move your things today. I'll fix the roof Thursday, if the weather holds." He fixed the roof Thursday. The weather held. She moved to the front room, which was larger and had a window that looked west, and she lay awake that first night, looking at the last of the light on the ceiling, and thought about what it meant to be in a place where the practical was taken care of, without making you feel like a burden for requiring it. In every other place she had been since her parents died. Her aunt's house in Clarisholm, the rooming house in Lethbridge, the 6 months with the Hargreave family, where she had lasted exactly as long as it took for Mrs. Hargreave to decide she was a threat rather than a help. She had learned to make herself small, to take up as little room as possible, to not mention the leaking roof, to eat standing at the kitchen bench. Cormac Rayleigh didn't seem to notice that she was trying to be small. He kept handing her things. The ledger, the broken handle on the dry goods crate that he replaced without comment and left neatly mended, on the back step, the information about the roof, as though it had simply not occurred to him to treat her otherwise. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know whether she trusted it. October came in hard, the way Alberta Octobers do, with a wind off the mountains that meant business. The nearest neighbors were the Calloways. Different family entirely from anything in her life before. 4 miles east along the road, and they came by on a Saturday with preserves, and the kind of cheerful nosiness that Hazel had learned to recognize as meaning well. Mrs. Calloway was a stout woman with clever eyes. She looked at Hazel the way she might look at a calf that had appeared in an unexpected field, with interest and a tentative assessment of its prospects. "You're the new girl," she said, in a tone that was not unkind. "Hazel Dorn," said Hazel, "temporary housekeeper." "Of course," said Mrs. Calloway, in a tone that suggested she did not think this was the whole story. They sat in the kitchen and drank tea, and Mrs. Calloway talked at a comfortable pace about the winter ahead, and the price of flour, and the Mackintosh boy's new horse, and a woman named Mrs. Ingram in Larkmoor, who had said something uncharitable about someone's pie at the church social, which was apparently a significant local event. Hazel listened and offered the biscuits she'd made that morning, and kept her hands around her teacup. Cormac came in from the barn at one point, said hello to the Calloways, took a biscuit without sitting down, and went back out. Mrs. Calloway watched him go. Then she looked at the biscuit tin with an expression Hazel couldn't quite read. "He took a biscuit," she said. "There were plenty," said Hazel. "He never takes anything from the kitchen when there are guests," said Mrs. Calloway. "He stands there and waits for them to leave, and then he eats cold whatever's left. He's been doing it for the 6 years I've known him." She looked at Hazel. He took a biscuit. Hazel didn't say anything. She refilled Mrs. Calloway's cup. The evenings were long once the days shortened. He had books, more than she'd expected, ranged along the shelf in the main room, with the haphazard arrangement of someone who actually reads rather than someone who displays. She borrowed one without asking, because she needed something for her hands to do after supper, and she half expected him to say something about it. He didn't, but she caught him looking. Once, at the spine of the book she'd chosen. A collection of Tennyson, which she'd picked without thinking much about it. And something shifted briefly in his expression before he looked away at the fire. She almost asked about it. She didn't. It was not until the following week, when she was carrying the mended feed account to the desk and knocked the almanac, sideways reaching, for the inkwell, that she found the pressed wild flower tucked inside the front cover of the Tennyson, and on the flyleaf, in handwriting that was not his. Rounder, more careful, the inscription, "For Cormac, who could read this before I could, and always pretended otherwise. M." She closed the book. She put it back on the shelf exactly where she'd found it. She didn't touch it again, but she thought about that inscription for days. The particular tenderness of it. Who could read this before I could, and always pretended otherwise? Someone had known him then. Had known the thing he hid. She looked at him across the supper table that evening, at the way he held his fork, careful and precise despite his large hands, at the way he read the almanac he'd taken down, as though he were already 3 paragraphs ahead of his eyes, and she thought, there is more here than he shows. She knew what that felt like. She thought most people did, if they'd lost enough. The first freeze came in the 3rd week of October. She woke at 4, to the sound of something she couldn't identify, and lay still in the darkness listening until she understood. It was Cormac, moving through the house to the back door, pulling on his coat. She heard the pump. She heard the barn door. She lay there another few minutes, and then got up because the stove had gone cold, and if she was going to be awake, she might as well be useful. She had coffee on by the time he came back in an hour later, breath clouding in the cold. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, exactly the way he'd stopped the first night, with that slight check in his movement that meant he'd been surprised by something and was composing himself around it. One of the mares was restless, he said. She's settled now. Coffee's ready, said Hazel. He sat at the kitchen table, instead of taking it to the main room, which was unusual. She put the cup in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it and looked at the steam. You didn't have to get up, he said. I was awake. He nodded. He drank the coffee. She sat across from him with her own cup, and they were quiet together in the pre-dawn dark, the stove ticking as it warmed, the wind pushing against the house. And it was, she thought later, when she tried to remember the exact texture of it, it was like being inside something rather than outside it, like being within the boundaries of something warm. She hadn't felt that in years. She hadn't let herself notice when she stopped feeling it. He looked up from his coffee. Miss Dorn, he said. Yes? You've been here nearly a month. 23 days, she said, and then felt immediately that she shouldn't have said so precisely. He didn't react to the precision. He turned the cup in his hands. I wrote to Audra, he said. She won't be back before February, maybe March. He paused. The position, if you want it, the position is through the winter at least. There'd be wages, proper ones. I should have said so at the start. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who has done something that cost him something and is not certain it was wise. Why didn't you say so at the start, she asked. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure you'd stay, he said. People don't always. I didn't want to. He stopped, turned the cup again. I thought you'd see the state of the place and think better of it. The state of the place is fine, she said. It needed someone to keep the books. Something, not quite a smile, but close to one, moved at the edge of his mouth. It did, he said. It needed that, Then yes, said Hazel. I'll stay the winter. November was calving, which she had not anticipated. She had not anticipated it, but she adjusted. Because adjusting was something she was practiced at, and because there was something in the particular logic of it, the cold and the work and the small lives that needed tending that she understood. She learned to read the signs he pointed out briefly and without condescension, the way she imagined a good teacher teaches, assuming competence, filling in only the gaps. She learned which of the cows needed watching. She learned that the old roan with the crooked ear was a difficult case and required sitting with. She sat with her one night for 3 hours in the cold barn. And Cormac came and found her there at 2 in the morning and didn't say anything ridiculous about her going back inside. He sat down on the other side of the pen and they waited it out together, and in the end it was all right, and the calf was small but breathing, and she felt, without expecting to, a complicated gladness that had nothing to do with competence. Good, he said when it was over. Just that, but he was looking at her when he said it, not at the calf. She looked away first, she wasn't sure why. There were things she didn't say. She didn't say that the winter had started to feel less like something to survive, and more like something she was living in. She didn't say that she had begun to think of the morning coffee as hers to make, not because it was her job. It was her job, but because she wanted to. She didn't say that she had started talking to the yellow dog the way she used to talk to her sister. When she'd had a sister, in the comfortable way of someone who knows they'll be heard, even when they aren't being listened to. She didn't say that she had noticed that he always brought the wood in without being asked, that he noticed before she did when the flour was running low and came back from Larkmoor with a new sack, that he knocked before he opened any door in his own house. A habit so ingrained, she didn't think he knew he did it. She didn't say that she thought about the inscription in the Tennyson and wondered what it had cost him to keep it on the shelf instead of putting it somewhere private, somewhere away. She didn't say any of it. She was 26 years old and the last of her family, and she had spent 7 years learning to be careful with the things that mattered. He, for his part, didn't say anything either, but he fixed the latch on the root cellar door that had been loose since she arrived, without her mentioning it, without pointing out that he'd done it. She found it one morning simply done, repaired, solid in its frame. She stood there holding the door open for longer than necessary. The letter from Mrs. Phelps arrived in December. She had the baby in early November, and the baby was strong, and Mrs. Phelps wrote with the warmth of a woman who has been through something significant and is grateful for everything that is solid and known. She wrote to Cormac, and she wrote, separately, a brief note to Hazel, which surprised her. I hope you have found it manageable, Mrs. Phelps wrote. Cormac is not an easy man to know, but he is a good one. I think you will have found that out by now. Hazel folded the note and put it in her coat pocket, with the original advertisement from the bulletin, which she had carried all this time, without quite deciding why. She showed him his letter. She kept hers to herself. He read his at the kitchen table after supper, and when he looked up his expression was the private, loosened kind that people have when they've heard from someone they love. She's well? Said Hazel. She is, he said. The baby is a girl. He paused. She says she's glad you stayed. She doesn't know me, said Hazel. She trusts my word. He folded the letter carefully. I told her you sorted out the feed accounts in one afternoon. The edge of that almost smile again. She has been trying to get those accounts sorted for 2 years. Hazel looked at her hands around her cup. I like figures, she said. They don't argue back. No, he said. He was quiet a moment. Is that why you like them? It wasn't quite a question. She looked up. He was looking at her in the steady, unhurried way he had, The way she'd learned was not rudeness, not intrusion, but simply attention. He didn't look away from things he was interested in. He just waited. I learned to be careful with words, she said. After a while. After my parents, and then after my sister, there were so many words that couldn't do what words are supposed to do. She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. Figures are honest, she said. They add up or they don't. He didn't say I'm sorry for your losses, which she had heard so many times it had become a kind of noise. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, my mother couldn't read. She looked at him. She learned later, in her 40s. My father taught her. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands. She was ashamed of it her whole life before that. Kept it from everyone. Wouldn't go to town for the papers. Wouldn't write letters. Wouldn't sign things. A pause. She was the sharpest person I ever knew. There was nothing wrong with her mind. It was just the one thing she'd never had the chance at. Hazel thought of the Tennyson on the shelf. Who could read this before I could, and always pretended otherwise. The inscription in the book? She said, and then stopped. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to look. It's all right. He was quiet for a long moment. She gave it to me when she learned. She was proud. He looked at the fire. She died 3 years ago. She was only 58. I'm sorry, said Hazel, and she meant it in the actual sense, not the noise sense. She would have liked you, he said, simply. The stove ticked. The dog shifted under the table. Hazel held her coffee cup and thought that there was a particular kind of conversation that you didn't plan, that arrived without announcement, and left you different than it found you. She didn't look away from him this time. Christmas at Larkmoor Station was quiet. The Callaways invited them both for Christmas dinner, and they went, and it was warm and crowded in the Callaway house, and Mrs. Callaway served a goose and 4 kinds of pie and was satisfied with herself about it. Hazel helped clear and wash up and felt unexpectedly like she was allowed to be there. Not like a hired woman who had been invited out of consideration, but like a person who was simply present because she lived nearby and was known. On the walk home in the snow, they had taken the wagon, but the road back was easier on foot, and they'd left the horse at the Callaway's barn, she said, without planning to. I didn't think I'd like it here. He glanced at her sideways. They were walking side by side, close because the packed trail was narrow between the drifts. When you arrived, he said, when I got off the train in Larkmoor. She looked up at the sky, which was very clear and thick with stars in the way of cold nights. I'd been to a lot of places since my parents died. I'd made a lot of starts. She paused. I kept thinking this won't work either. You'll last until spring and then you'll move on. She looked down at her boots in the snow. That was 4 months ago. It's January, he said. I know. They walked. The snow was squeaking under their feet, the way it only does when it's very cold. I've been thinking, he said, after a while, about the spring. Something in her chest did something quiet and involuntary. What about it? Audra will be back. Or she says she will. He was looking ahead at the road. The position. As her housekeeper, it goes back to her. It wouldn't be right otherwise. I know that, said Hazel. But, he said, and then he stopped. He stopped walking, which meant she stopped too. And they were standing in the road in the dark, with the stars above them, and the snow all around, and the lights of Larkmoor Station visible in the distance. But the books need keeping, he said. Someone to keep the books. The accounts. That's That's not the same as what Audra does. That would be a different arrangement. She looked at him. He was looking past her, at the middle distance, at nothing in particular. A different arrangement, she repeated. I thought. He stopped again. He reached up and adjusted his hat, which did not need adjusting, which she had come to understand was what he did when he was saying something that cost him something. "There's a lot of land here," he said. "More than one person should manage. I've been managing it alone for a long time. There were reasons for that. But reasons change." "Cormac," she said. And it was the first time she had used his given name, and she heard herself say it and did not take it back. He looked at her then. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, that is full of something being carefully, slowly decided. "Yes," he said, "I am." She looked at him standing in the road in the starlight, big and still and honest, and she thought about all the places she had stood before, all the starts she had made and set down, and she thought that there was a difference between a start and an arrival, that she had not known until just now what an arrival felt like. "Then I'll stay," she said. "Not for the books." Something opened in his face. Not dramatically, he was not a man for drama, just a slight careful opening, like a door in a house that has been cold for a long time, letting in the first warmth of spring. "No," he said, "not for the books." They walked the rest of the way back in the kind of silence that does not need filling. Mrs. Phelps came back in March. She was shorter than Hazel had imagined, and louder and warmer. And she came through the door of Larkmoor Station with her baby on her hip, and looked immediately at Hazel, and then at Cormac, and then at the 2 cups on the kitchen table, and the ledger open on the desk, with Hazel's handwriting in it. And she said nothing at all for a moment, which was apparently unusual enough that Cormac noticed it. "You've met Miss Dorn," he said. "I have now," said Mrs. Phelps. She shifted the baby to her other hip and extended her hand to Hazel, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite amusement and not quite relief. "He wrote to me in February," she said. "He said you'd sorted the accounts." "I did," said Hazel. "He said you were staying on." "I am." Mrs. Phelps looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at Cormac. "She fixed the feed accounts in one afternoon," she said to him, as if he hadn't been the one to tell her. "She did," he said. "I tried to do those accounts for 2 years. I know." Mrs. Phelps laughed. It was a large, wholehearted laugh, and Hazel found she was smiling without deciding to. "Well," said Mrs. Phelps, "you'd better show me what you did with them. Because if you're going to be here, I want to understand the system." She put the baby on the kitchen bench with the practiced ease of someone who trusts the surface. "And then I want a cup of tea, and I want to know everything." Hazel made the tea. She showed her the accounts. She told her what she chose to tell her, and kept the rest, which was considerable, in the way that people keep the things that are most theirs. Later, after Mrs. Phelps had gone to her rooms to settle the baby, Hazel was at the kitchen bench when she heard Cormac come in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway behind her. She didn't turn around. "She likes you," he said. "I like her." Hazel set the cups to dry. "She's easy to like. She said you were a sensible woman." "She's right." A pause. "She also said," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that she had learned by now to read. The careful quality of it when something mattered. She said it was about time. Hazel turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he was looking at her in the direct, steady way that she no longer found unnerving, but had come to understand was the most honest thing about him. "About time for what?" she said. "I didn't ask," he said. "I thought I probably knew." She looked at him. She thought about the inscription in the Tennyson, "Who could read this before I could?" and always pretended otherwise. And she thought about the latch on the root cellar, and the roof fixed on Thursday, and the coffee at 4 in the morning in the cold kitchen, and 100 small and unannounced things that added up, that had been adding up, the way figures do when you keep an honest account. "So did I," she said. He put his hat on its peg. He came into the kitchen and stood beside her at the bench, not quite touching, and looked out the window at the March sky, which was doing the particular thing that Alberta March skies do when the cold is finally thinking about letting go. "The books are a mess again," he said. "They always will be," she said. "You should have someone who can fix them." "I should," he said. "I do." Outside, the first pale suggestion of green was beginning in the field below the poplars. The yellow dog was in the yard, nose to the ground, interested in something in the new earth. The sky was very large, and the land was very quiet, and the kitchen was warm, and Hazel Dorn stood beside Cormac Rayleigh in it, and found, with some surprise, that she was not counting this as a start at all. She was already home.